policy evaluations, there's often a concern that even if you've dealt with sort of issues of internal validity, is the question whether the benefits that you find are persistent over time or whether they fade over time. That's always in general an issue. And then a second issue is that maybe if one generation gets these benefits, maybe some of that also gets transmitted to the next generation, or the policy that you're evaluating might have long-term effects. And it's important from an evaluation perspective that you measure all the benefits and all the costs, and then you can get to efficient provision, which otherwise you wouldn't. Okay, that's sort of an obvious point. Now, taking this to the education and sort of economics of education literature that looks at impacts of school resources on student outcomes, be that completed years of schooling, so attainment or achievement, we have evidence from both developed and developing countries that these interventions can work. Our study builds on an earlier paper that I have with another co-author. So this happened in the early 80s. In this paper, we look in 91 census. And then now in this paper, we look at subsequent censuses, to 2000 census in Brazil and the 2010 census, to see whether the impacts we find in 91 persist. And then we have these test score data. So on the horizontal axis, you have municipality population. So there's like 5,000 municipalities in Brazil. From the 1980 census, you can count a number of people. And then based on that, over the subsequent 4 years, basically, you get money. And you can see here what we're going to do. We're going to compare municipalities that had in the census 10,189 inhabitants to those that had just below. And I find impacts. I say, well, let's look at some other years, other cohorts. Let's look at other aspects of the test score distribution, and there's just impacts everywhere. One explanation could be that the initial temporary funding, funded capital improvements that still produce services even, 20 years down the road. It's possible. An additional channel that we had in mind was through parents. Okay, so we have basically, I'll do the back of the envelope calculations later on, but you have like 10% of the municipality getting an additional year of schooling, more or less. Okay, so a relatively large chunk, and these are now parents. Okay, so it could be through parents. Now it turns out that in these test score data, they're also asking the kids to fill out a survey about parental education. Okay, so we can, for the same test takers here, we can match this to their parents, and we find impacts on the education levels of these parents. So at the cutoffs, education is higher for these parents. Okay? So that's our evidence of intergenerational transmission. But we don't want to say it's the only thing. There might be other channels that are there that we just cannot measure. Over time, education quality probably improved. If you think that teacher quality is an input, improved over time. So the younger kids were exposed to better school quality. Okay? And that might account for the fact that if the channel is parental education, then we don't find impacts for them because they already have better schooling, whereas the older kids, they didn't, and the parental education might have mattered more. We would like, some back of the envelope calculations to see how much of the test score gain that we find can be accounted for by the education of the parents alone. Okay. Now the issue is that we don't have many studies actually. We found one that quantifies sort of causally the link between a year of parental schooling with achievements, sort of test score gains of the kids. That one study is for the US. Okay, and what they find is a 1 year increase in parental education increases test scores of the kids in sort of comparable age ranges by 0.1 standard deviation. So what we do here is sort of, let's assume that the impact of parental education on test scores is twice that in Brazil, make that up, and then account for the fact that only about 20% of the parents were plausibly, because of their age, affected by the additional funding. So we get an expected impact of 0.04 and we find 0.08. So there's sort of a missing thing which suggests to us that education might be one channel, but it's not the only one. And another one we have evidence on is income. So poverty goes down, income itself, so even parents whose education was not affected, their income might have been affected, and that itself might also have helped boost test scores.